campfire flame.
An overview of where we are with the Sasquatch. And now I'm going to ask Dr. Jeff Meldrum to come up and do a talk and give you some scientific facts.
Okay. Well, it's truly a privilege and a pleasure to be with you here tonight on this occasion. I especially would like to thank the director and staff of this institution for undertaking this event. In doing so, they've joined a succession of other like-minded institutions that have kept this conversation going, as you were aptly put, while obviously tapping into the keen enthusiasm for this subject. I also have the sense that they're aspiring to provide information in an objective and a factual way. And it's in that vein that I'd like to share with you some of my perspectives on the context of this question, this Sasquatch phenomenon, in the broader panorama of the human experience, but more specifically within the context of our growing understanding of the framework of human and hominid and hominoid evolution, and the question that is starting to gain some traction in the scientific community and engender some interesting discussion, that of the notion of relic hominoids, populations or species that have persisted into the present and maybe sharing the planet with us. So that's the topic, Sasquatch and other wild men. Now, I'm gratified by a sense of a change in the perception or the presentation of this question of the existence of Sasquatch. You know, it wasn't too long ago that it was kind of a dodgy undertaking to do one of these documentaries, because the standard formula was I would be interviewed, and then unbeknownst to me, some armchair skeptic would be interviewed, and we'd be juxtaposed on the documentary as if we're responding to each other's questions, when really neither of us had any knowledge of the other's responses or the opportunity to react to those. And often the armchair skeptics that they would recruit were not inexperienced in this field, had devoted no effort to study it really, but just provide a knee-jerk reaction. If you go online now, of course there's no one I think would ever turn a page in a dictionary, a paper printed dictionary these days, or very rarely anymore, but the plethora of online dictionaries have definitions of Sasquatch that are very similar to this one. A large, hairy, humanoid creature said to live in wilderness areas of the United States and Canada, said named Bigfoot. I've underlined, I've added emphasis to said. This is a pretty reasonable definition. There's no allusion to mythology or legend or any of those aspects, but still couching it in a tentative manner, because obviously we don't have conclusive proof. And I'm not here to convince you of the existence of this creature. I'm here just to share some information. Why I still, after 15 years engaging in this subject, am still quite intrigued by the prospect and still continue doing it. Oh. It's also gratifying, and a BC connection here, another Canadian connection here, it's gratifying to see professionals of acclaim and stature take the subject seriously as well. You may have seen this portrait that was painted by Robert Bateman, a Canadian naturalist and conservationist and a very talented artist. I'm kind of a frustrated avocational artist myself, and I've always admired his wildlife portraiture. You can kind of see here too the inspiration for his perception of Sasquatch. And if you'll indulge me, did I do that? I did. I turned it off, didn't I? There we go. Here's his description of his painting. He says, "The moss-draped branches barely part as a large dark shadow moves swiftly through the forest. It is a vertical shape, over 6 feet tall. Its long legs rule out a bear. It must be a primate. But is it ape or human? Apes do not stride in such a full, easy manner, and humans are not covered from head to toe with shaggy dark hair. There is no such animal in any of the mammal guides, and yet it must exist because there are so many reported sightings. Even allowing for some hoaxes and downright fabrications, there are enough stories which have the ring of truth to convince some distinguished scientists of the possibility of the existence of the huge man-ape creature. Even Jane Goodall and George Schaller have been positive about the possibility. The Salish tribe of southwest British Columbia called the being SASQUATCH, meaning hairy man, from which we have coined the name SASQUATCH. It is also called Bigfoot, since the footprints are up to 22 inches long, averaging 16 inches and 1/3 wider than human prints of the same length. Most of the sightings come from remote, densely forested areas, seldom visited by humans. Sasquatches are generally shy and move away quickly, although a few frightening incidents have been reported. 2 men in a truck camper on the west side of Harrison Lake, BC, noticed an ape-like face in their window and almost immediately afterward felt their vehicle being shaken as if to overturn it. Uncommonly, there are intimidation displays, breaking branches, running back and forth, throwing stones. These are behaviors similar to those of chimps when they are angry or distressed. Perhaps this rare animal is a descendant of Gigantopithecus, a giant fossil ape of Asia, but until we get some tangible evidence, bones, teeth, hair, that can be submitted to DNA testing, this fascinating mammal will not appear in the field guides. So that's a pretty comprehensive little but succinct summary there by Bateman himself. One of his reviewers, an art critic, said this, which I thought was interesting. Far from detracting from a serious painter's body of work, we believe this painting adds to Bateman's cachet for having the ability to at least ponder the possibility. And that's a good sign that the conversation has turned in that direction. I've also had the privilege of working with another professional. This is Jim Halfpenny here, to my side here. He is a renowned tracker, travels the world teaching courses in animal tracking. And he approached me about the possibility of collaborating on a workshop. So our fledgling weekend workshop took place this couple of months ago up in Gardner, Montana, at the north entrance of Yellowstone, and we spent a couple of days discussing the tracking of rare and elusive animals, from Bigfoot to cougars, wolves, and grizzlies, which are his particular specialty. And that was a very gratifying experience. We'll be doing that again early this spring. There we go. All right. So as we think about this subject of the wild man, the wild man image is almost iconic. Well, it really is iconic, almost an archetype. And some would suggest, some scholars have suggested that it is simply a manifestation of the human psyche, our connection or our sense of connection to the wilderness. Perhaps an echoing of some racial memory of interacting with other pre-human hominids that we may have coexisted with. I would only take exception to the notion that it is universal, because it's not. There's a remarkable correlation, as I hope you'll see as we progress here, with the local ecology. These creatures are wild men of the forest, and they are only reported from areas of dense forest cover and rugged, remote mountainous areas. The green man is another sort of manifestation of this wild man. It sort of grew out of the wild man tradition, but took on a different persona, that of the consort to Mother Nature, if you will. Instead of just simply being covered with hair, it became covered with the verdant greenery of the forest. And it's kind of tempting to wonder if, because in the original depictions, it was much more similar to this, where you have a hairy wild man that appears to be peering out through the green foliage. Eventually the foliage became the covering, even to the point of issuing from the mouth to represent him as the source of the verdant greenery of the forest. You know, could this representation actually hark back to memories of that, other wild man peering out of the forest at its hairless cousin, looking after the activities, the sights and sounds and smells of civilized human activity? It's kind of funny if you look at some of the carvings, some of the depictions of the wild men. Some are quite stylized, some are quite fanciful, some are quite realistic looking. This one is on a portal in the Notre Dame Cathedral, and you can see a typical wild man covered with hair, just the hands and feet bare, the very deep face, and heavy brow, low forehead, and your typical peasant here alongside. If this sculptor had had in front of him a skull of a classic Neanderthal compared with that of a modern human, he couldn't have made a better depiction of the very distinctions of the cranial anatomy that distinguish, that differentiate Neanderthals from modern humans. So it raises the question, could some of this tradition of the wild man that was so steeped in the traditions of medieval Europe have been spawned from our recollection of sharing that continent with a pre-human hominid at some time? Interesting to contemplate. Now, it's important to recognize that in these early traditions, there wasn't a notion of an evolutionary history. Instead, nature was seen as the result of a creative effort, of a perfect creative effort, that created, that represented a scale from the simplest to the most complex, with humans here, as the scriptural passage says, placed just a little lower than the angels in the scale of things. It's this notion of creation, which was also referred to as not only the scale of nature, but the great chain of being, that gave rise to this term, the missing link. You know, we think of it in terms of an evolutionary context, but it originated as a representation of a missing link in that perfect chain of being. If creation is perfect, it's perfect in its completeness. And so we would expect there to be forms that fill the void, the very obvious void between the animal kingdom and humanity. And so, as the discipline of biology, of natural theology at the time, study of the creation in order to understand the creator better, became more and more widespread. And Linnaeus set out to catalog all of nature, all of creation, as his students returned from, and travelers and explorers from the remote corners of the globe, came back with stories of strange man-like animals. That was perfectly acceptable. That was to be expected. These were the missing links in the great chain of being. And Linnaeus actually in his Systema Naturae, his catalog of classification, erected a taxon, a nomen, called the anthropomorpha, the man-shaped creatures. And these were some examples. Now it's interesting, as you look at these, you can begin to recognize some of them. For example, this one is an orangutan. Very distinctive, the very exceptionally long digits, the very reduced short palates really gives it away, just the foot itself. Now I'd add that the walking stick is just an artistic tool to suggest that these animals weren't very adept at walking on their two hind feet, on their bipedally. Not that they actually employed a walking stick. Here we have a chimpanzee. This is a gelada baboon, and they've got the details down to even this little, looks almost like a necklace around her, across her chest there. The geladas have a bare chest, and they have a little string of, or a little sequence of little blistery vesicles, which during estrus become quite tumescent, look like a little glistening crystal necklace across their neck. But you can see the feet, you can see the tail. But notice the anthropomorphic face, you know, kind of some artistic license there. And then there was the troglodyte, another member of the genus Homo. We were Homo sapiens. You know, it wasn't just a sort of a egocentric notion that we're going to call ourselves the wise species, but we were wise compared to Homo troglodytes, the caveman, cave woman in this case, a nocturnal, mute, hair-covered, primitive type of human, type of Homo, that was juxtaposed against us. Now, well, just to point out, see the anthropomorphic face given this creature, you know, when many saw this as just a sort of a derogatory depiction of a native woman from Southeast Asia, but perhaps that same artistic license was used to sort of soften the description of a much more primitive looking anthropomorph. Linnaeus was criticized for erecting this category, and here was his response. And I put the whole thing here, if you'll indulge me, because I think it's kind of interesting. Oftentimes amongst the Bigfoot community, there's sometimes heated debates about whether Sasquatch is closer to human or closer to ape. And in reality, a lot of people who take exception to the label of ape don't really understand what apes are and their behaviors and anatomy. And so I had to actually take some solace in Linnaeus' response here. He said, let's not quibble over words. It will be the same to me whatever name we apply. But I seek for you and from the whole world a generic difference between man and simian. The argument here was, it was unjustified, his critics felt, for uniting humans with other apes, with other primates. Man and simian, that follows from the principles of natural history. I absolutely know of none. If only someone might tell me a single one. If I would have called a man a simian, or vice versa, I would have brought together all the theologians against me. Perhaps I ought to have, by virtue of the law of the discipline. Maybe he would have been justified by the principles of classification, in other words. So, we have this juxtaposition of two types of people on the planet. Now, it never quite got the reception amongst the scientific community. Blumenbach, later, much later, he was actually credited with the first formal description of chimpanzees and its proper taxonomic nomenclature. He described Homo troglodytes as the great mistake of Linnaeus' effort. And he argued instead that Homo troglodytes was a confused description mixing traits of humans and chimpanzees. This isn't Meldrum's thesis here of a hybrid between humans and apes, but to create a Sasquatch, but just showing a combination of characteristics, rather. Okay, so but Blumenbach was satisfied to accept primates, which replaced anthropomorpha, but there were only three types that he was aware of. Homo sapiens, and then amongst the simia, there was the common chimpanzee, and this is supposed to be an orangutan. It actually looks more like a chimpanzee, not a very good depiction. The gorilla wasn't discovered for quite almost another century. So it wasn't added to that litany of primates for quite some time. Now, the notion of Homo troglodytes was resurrected in the context of Sasquatch, a connection with Sasquatch or Wildman, by Boris Porozhnev, who was a Russian scientist, not a biologist though, not even an anthropologist really, but he did manage to get his manuscript published in Current Anthropology. And it evoked quite an interesting set of responses. Current Anthropology has the formula, when a paper is published, it's followed by commentary from a number of scholars, invited commentary, that are formally reviewed and published themselves. And so, unfortunately, the paper, while it broached a real interesting topic, this notion of relic hominoids, he did it rather clumsily, unfortunately, and so it never really got the attention or the acceptance that might have advanced us quite a bit. Okay, so that's the point. So we went from a context where of special creation, the notion that all these species were individually and separately placed here, and that the wild man was just another type of creature that must have been created for some reason. We went from that to now we're getting into an evolutionary perspective where things have a relationship by descent. But in the early writings, journalistic writings of European colonists or residents of North America with wild men, they had no context. They had very little idea about the known great apes, and they certainly had no idea about primitive human ancestors. And so all they brought with them from Europe was this notion of the wild man. So when you see newspaper accounts from this time period, they're described as the wild man of the woods. Now this one, it appeared in the Adams Sentinel in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, but it's describing an event that took place in Arkansas. And let me advance one more time. Here's the critical paragraph describing this encounter, and it's remarkably familiar sounding. He was of gigantic stature, the body being covered with hair, and the head with long locks that fairly enveloped his neck and shoulders. The wild man, after looking at them deliberately for a short time, turned and ran away with great speed, leaping from 12 to 14 feet at a time. His footprints measured 13 inches each. Now that could be transposed into the present and sound very similar to a lot of descriptions of encounters. That deliberate watching, that interest is kind of like the wild man peering, or the green man peering out through the foliage, interest in human activities, curiosity because of that greater intelligence.
As far as I can, hidden away from man, living off the forest and drinking from streams.